Recording in progress.
Welcome to another episode of Wildcard Wednesday. It is March 4th, 2026. So I only received one case over the past week, so I only have one case to cover for today. So I do want to remind anybody that is listening, I do rely on my audience to submit cases. So if you have any cases that you would like for me to take a look at and code for you, please submit them, and then I will feature them in a future episode of Wildcard Wednesday. The way to submit your cases is to go to radrx.com and then select the contact us option, which is in the top right-hand corner of the screen, and then use the contact us form to submit your case. As always, please be sure that the case is de-identified and that only the case details, the case steps are included in the documentation that you are sending. So this week's case features angioplasty and atherectomy in the lower extremities. So I believe this is the first time that I'm looking at a case with the new lower extremity codes, if I remember correctly. I may have covered one in a prior week, but I don't think that I did. So this particular one, we're going to go ahead and jump right into it. Now, for this particular report that I received, I don't know if I received all of the documentation associated with the case. The only information that was sent to me was the first statement that says comparison was with a CTA 2 days ago. So that's the only thing that I know about prior imaging. So with that being said, I don't have the ability to determine in this particular case whether or not we're going to report diagnostic angiography. There is not anything in this case further down that says that the decision to intervene was based on the findings. So I don't know whether or not this imaging is diagnostic. I would need to have additional details, look at other parts of the medical record to be able to make the determination definitively, but I will mention the imaging codes just for your benefit for learning purposes. So you will see what imaging codes would be assigned if the CPT criteria are met. And that's something that I've covered in past sessions. I've talked through that about that decision to intervene really being the key factor and whether or not you're going to report diagnostic angiography. So I'm not going to review that today because I know I've discussed it recently, but in future episodes, I will mention it again for sure. Okay, so this case, when we look at the second paragraph here in the report, we see a mention of ultrasound guidance, and it says that the ultrasound demonstrated a patent left common femoral artery. And then we see the image documenting needle position is archived. So we can go ahead and assign the 76937 for this. So I'm going to go ahead and add that there right now. I didn't add it in, but I'm going to put that there. So you can see that we are going to assign based on that documentation. Then from there, we see that the catheter goes into the abdominal aorta and an abdominal aortogram is performed. And then from there, we see that the catheter was withdrawn down to the aortic bifurcation. So remember, I don't know whether or not this should be coded as diagnostic imaging, but in the event, let's assume that we had a required documentation and we were going to report it. When we look at the findings, we see that there's mention of the abdominal aorta, and then there's mention of the left renal and the right renal. You may remember in past episodes, I talked about how a true abdominal aortogram, a full and complete abdominal aortogram, will mention the abdominal aorta, the origins of the left renal, the right renal, and the origins of the celiac, the IMA, and the SMA. So in a perfect world and a perfect documentation scenario, that's what you would see, but oftentimes the physician may not mention the SMA, the IMA, or the celiac. So in a situation like this, if I'm auditing the case and if they have coded 75625, I will allow it because at least I know that we had that catheter placed up higher in the aorta in order to perform an abdominal aortogram because I see that the origins of the renals are mentioned, but I will put in a documentation recommendation on this to document a complete abdominal aortogram. So that's how I would handle it from an auditing perspective. If there wasn't anything mentioned about those renal artery origins, then I would not allow the 75625 because I wouldn't be able to tell where the catheter was in the aorta, but at least the mention of the origins of the renal arteries gives me a clue. And so we also see in the next statement that the catheter was withdrawn down to the bifurcation, and then selective bilateral lower extremity angiography was performed. So we wouldn't assign code 75630 for a runoff because this study was done from two catheter placements, one in the higher in the aorta around the level of the renals, and then a second catheter placement further down at the aortic bifurcation. So we had the catheter pulled down to the bifurcation. That's a second catheter placement. So that means we're going to report the abdominal aortogram and the extremity imaging separately when it's done from two different catheter placements. So we see that there are findings for the right lower extremity, and I've highlighted the findings in the right lower extremity in purple for the vessels we're going to see treated in this report. So there's a severe stenosis in the mid portion of the SFA, disease in the popliteal, and then a multifocal stenosis, 90% in the posterior tibial artery. And then we have other findings for the right lower extremity. Then we see in the next paragraph, we have findings in the left lower extremity. So since both extremities were viewed in their entirety, we have code 75716. Now remember, this is if all of our criteria for diagnostic imaging is met in order to be able to assign those codes. So now let's go down to the next paragraph. So the physician says, I proceeded with right lower extremity intervention. So we see, again, severe stenoses in the posterior tibial artery were crossed. The physician had some trouble crossing the lesion, but eventually was able to cross the stenosis and then performed angioplasty in the posterior tibial artery. And I underlined mid and distal portions of the posterior tibial artery because this is going to come into play in just a moment when we're looking at another procedure that occurred. So at this point, we have an angioplasty in that posterior tibial artery. So we're going to code that to the tibial perineal territory, and it's a straightforward lesion in this particular instance. So that ends up being a 37280 for that angioplasty of a straightforward lesion. Then when we go down to the last paragraph, the physician says that he had turned attention to the severe disease in the superficial femoral. Then we see embolic protection is placed, and then an atherectomy is performed. And then also angioplasty was performed as well. And then a stent was also placed. So if we're going down to the second page, so we've had angioplasty, we've seen atherectomy, and then we ultimately see a stent placed. So all three procedures were performed in this femoral popliteal segment here. And this is going to be a straightforward lesion. We know that from our findings. And so that's going to end up being coded with 37275, which is going to be for angioplasty, atherectomy, and stent, all performed in the same vessel. When we go down to that last paragraph that describes the steps of the procedure, it says that angiography of the remainder of the right lower extremity was performed, and this did reveal a short segment occlusion in the distal posterior tibial artery. The posterior tibial artery was selected, and aspiration thrombectomy was performed in the occlusion with the Terumo aspiration catheter. And then I performed repeat angioplasty with the jade balloon. So the reason why I underlined back here the portion of the vessel that we were treating is because I wanted to match it up with the work that was performed for the thrombectomy, because the situation is we had this angioplasty that was performed in that posterior tibial artery, and then it appears that everything is good with the posterior tibial artery from what we're seeing here. But then when we get down to this last paragraph here, after both interventions are done, then we see this occlusion that's in the posterior tibial artery. So I wanted to make sure that that occlusion was not already there for that particular portion of the artery. So by putting the details together in the report, this tells me that this thrombectomy ended up occurring as a result of this procedure that occurred in the femoral territory. So I went ahead and added the 37186 for the thrombectomy. And I just want to remind everybody, while we're on the topic of thrombectomy and atherectomy, to remind everyone that the NCCI manual says that when atherectomy and thrombectomy are performed in the same territory, the thrombectomy is going to be bundled with the atherectomy. But here we only had angioplasty done in that posterior tibial. The atherectomy was done in the femoral territory. So we do have the ability to pick up that 37186. And yes, we can report that if the occlusion is removed, if an aspiration catheter is used, yes, we can use 37186 for that thrombectomy. So again, I wanted to make sure that we're not coming back and treating the same thing. So I went back and looked at the prior findings to indeed confirm that this was a result of the procedure that was just performed. So although it doesn't have the documentation I would like to see exactly, that's part of being a coder, reading through the report, looking at the context, and then putting all of the puzzle pieces together. So that is our case for March 4th. And next week, I hope to be back with another case. Please send me some cases. As long as I keep getting cases, I'll keep posting them every week. So thank you and have a great rest of your week.